In this video, we're going to take a look at possible pitfalls in collecting data and in statistics. Right? And so as we take a look at these possible pitfalls, our first possible pitfall is going to be when we have misleading conclusions. So misleading conclusions. And the major misleading conclusion that we might have is causation versus correlation. So causation versus correlation. Just because two things are correlated does not mean that one thing actually causes the other. Right? So you will find that as ice cream sales increase, violent crime rate also tends to increase. Does this mean that ice cream is causing people to be more violent? I think that is unlikely. Doesn't mean that people being violent is causing more people to buy ice cream. I think it probably doesn't. Right? So those two things are going up at the same time, but just because they are correlated doesn't mean that there is a causal relationship between the two. One is not necessarily causing the other. Right? So we have causation and correlation. We have these misleading conclusions. We also should be careful of reported results. And when I think of reported results, really what I'm thinking about is when the data is reported instead of measured, right? So if I go to, at least in some states, when you get your driver's license, you need to provide your height and your weight. Some states will measure your height and weight when you get your driver's license. Other states, they will just ask you, what is your height and weight? And for me, that's what happened when I got my license in, I don't remember which state I got my license in first, but that happened for me. The day that I got my license, I almost guarantee you that the height and weight were not accurate. I would guess that they were idealized versions of my height and weight. Right? So I might have added a little extra height because I wanted to be a little bit taller, or removed a couple extra pounds because I thought that I would lose that weight over the course of the year, right? And so my height and weight, those things might have been changed. They might have been off. We're almost certainly off from the actual values. And so those reported results are just not as maybe verifiable as the measured results. You should also be careful of small samples. So when you have a small sample, this is going to be bad news. With that small sample, if I were to say there was a school district, and in this school district, we had 66% of the people that were suspended multiple times. Right? That might sound like bad news until you hear that there were only 3 people in the school district that were suspended. And so 2 out of the 3 were suspended multiple times. Right? And so maybe that doesn't look so bad. That does get a little bit into one of the other things that we'll talk about a little bit later. Right? But small samples, those can be bad news. We can also run into issues with loaded questions. Right. So if I were to ask the question, should the president have veto power? Right. You have some opinion there. whatever that opinion is, you can imagine how a variety of people might have an opinion there. If I were to ask, should the president have veto power in order to eliminate wasteful spending? There, when I phrase the question that way, when I load the question that way, then the number of yes and no responses you can imagine might be drastically different than when I didn't include that additional phrase in order to eliminate wasteful spending. Right? That loaded question can change the results of the study. And so you should be aware of that. Doesn't mean that things are done incorrectly. Just be aware that if the question's loaded, that might be different than if the question's not loaded. That's part of how you might obtain different results for a very similar kind of question. You also run into different types of results when you change orders of questions. Right? So if you say, do you think that traffic contributes more to air pollution than industry? Or if you say, do you think industry contributes more to air pollution than traffic? When you change the order of those questions, then the responses, those also change. Right? If you're thinking about doing some political polling, and you say, do you prefer candidate A, B, C, or D? People tend to disproportionately answer with either A or B, especially if you have longer names. When the primary was going on, the Democratic primary was going on in 2020, early on, there were lots of names, and this became a little bit of an issue when one of the pollsters, they were changing orders of names, and names at the end just got dropped off, right? But that order matters, and you should pay attention to the order in which the questions are being asked, and you might want to vary that so that that order of questions plays less of an impact if you are doing the study yourself. We talked about this before, but non-response. So if someone refuses to respond, that's meaningful. You should note that if you are collecting data. So you check that for that non-response. You should check for missing data. All right, so are there any numbers that are missing? You should be wary of precise numbers. So in particular, when you think that the number is likely to not be exact in that moment, right? If I were to give you a very precise number for the population, the adult population of the United States down to the single individual person, you would say, oh, that's probably not the correct number. And why is that not the correct number? Well, because the moment I collected it, it was probably incorrect. It probably changed. Excuse me, I'm sorry. And then finally, we talked about this a little bit above, but that is percentages. So percentages can do things like hide small samples. You can also, when you have percentages, sometimes they're just not clear. Snickers now with 100% more peanuts. Right? Okay, so that percent is okay, but it's 100% more than what? 100% more than they used to have. 100% more peanuts than are in a Hershey's chocolate bar, which has no peanuts, right? And so 100% more than nothing is still nothing, right? And so those percentages, you should just be careful of them and think, ask questions, and think about that data as you think about statistics. So whether you are conducting a statistical process, a statistical study, or whether you're just consuming statistics, think about these possible pitfalls as you go through. All right, we will talk to you next time.